If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Bill Harrison, and this happened to me back in 1963 when I was working as a ranger in White Pine Valley, Wyoming. I am writing this down now because people need to know the truth about what's really hiding in those ancient pine forests. Even today, at 83, I still wake up in cold sweats remembering what I saw there. It was a brutal winter that year, probably the coldest I'd ever seen in my 45 years of life. The kind of cold that makes your bones ache and your breath freeze before it even leaves your mouth. I'd been posted at the ranger station in Bridger-Teton National Forest for about 3 years by then, mostly keeping to myself since Marie, my wife, lost her battle with cancer. The locals always told stories about White Pine Valley, stories about people going missing, about strange symbols appearing on trees overnight, and about something the Native Americans called those who walk between trees. I didn't believe any of it back then. After 20 years in the Rangers and serving as a sniper in Korea, I thought I'd seen everything there was to see. Boy, was I wrong. I lived in that small ranger cabin with my German Shepherd Rex, my only real friend after Marie passed. He was the smartest dog I'd ever known, trained him myself. I always kept two things with me: my lucky compass from my war days and Marie's silver locket with her picture inside. Those two items gave me comfort during those lonely nights in the valley. Looking back now, I should have noticed the warning signs sooner. The way Rex would sometimes stop and growl at empty spaces between trees. The way the temperature would suddenly drop on warm days. The way my radio would sometimes catch what sounded like children laughing, even though the nearest school was 50 miles away. But I guess sometimes we choose not to see what's right in front of us. That is, until we have no choice but to open our eyes, or in my case, the one eye I have left. Let me tell you what really happened that winter in White Pine Valley, but I warn you, after hearing this story, you might never look at shadows the same way again. It all started on a freezing December morning. I was doing my usual patrol, checking for any lost hikers or illegal campers, with Rex trotting happily beside me. The forest was quieter than usual that day. No bird songs, no squirrels rushing around, nothing. Just the sound of snow crunching under my boots and the wind whistling through the pine trees. That's when Rex suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, and he started whining, something he never did. About 50 feet ahead, I saw something dark in the snow. As I got closer, my stomach turned. It was a deer, but not like any deer kill I'd ever seen. The poor thing was twisted in an unnatural way, and its eyes, they were removed so cleanly it looked like surgery. No predator I knew could do that. I took some photos for the wildlife department and tried calling it in on my radio, but instead of the usual static or voice of dispatch, I heard something that made my skin crawl, the sound of children singing. It was faint, like it was coming from far away. But I knew that was impossible. There weren't any kids for miles around. That night, I couldn't sleep. The temperature dropped so low that my thermometer couldn't even read it. Rex was acting strange too, pacing around the cabin and refusing to look out the windows. I kept thinking about that deer and those kids' voices on the radio. The next morning was even stranger. I found weird symbols carved into the trees near my cabin, dozens of them. They looked ancient, like something from those Native American stories, but I knew those trees had been bare yesterday. I'd walked past them every day for 3 years. I developed the photos I'd taken of the deer in my small darkroom, but when I looked at them, my hands started shaking. Standing behind the dead deer, barely visible in the shadows of the trees, was something tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its skin looked almost see-through, like ice. I checked all 5 photos, and it was in each one, but in slightly different positions, as if it was moving closer. I am not a man who scares easily, The war taught me that fear is just your mind playing tricks on you. But something in those photos, something about the way that thing was looking right at the camera, I knew right then that the old stories about White Pine Valley weren't just stories anymore. And that was just the beginning of what would become the most terrifying winter of my life. A week after finding that deer, things got worse. Tom Phillips, a young ranger who just started working with us, went missing during his night patrol. We found him the next morning, and I wish I hadn't been there to see it. He was sitting up against a tree, frozen solid. But the strange thing was, it wasn't even that cold that day. The temperature was around 60 degrees, warm enough for just a light jacket. And his eyes, they were gone, just like the deer's. The local police came, but they had no answers. How could someone freeze to death on a warm day? While they were investigating, Mike Davidson, one of our regular hunters, reported seeing tall white figures moving through the trees. I didn't tell him about my photos. 2 days later, Mike disappeared too. We found his body in the same condition as Tom's. That's when I started connecting the dots. The symbols on the trees matched the ones in some old Native American books I had. They were warnings about creatures they called the Cold Ones, beings that could walk through solid objects and fed on human eyes and memories. I used to think these were just scary stories people told around campfires. Now I wasn't so sure. Rex knew something was wrong too. There were certain parts of the forest he absolutely refused to enter. He'd pull back on his leash, tail between his legs, whimpering like a puppy. Rex was the bravest dog I'd ever known. He'd face down bears without flinching. But something in those woods terrified him. I started noticing other things too. Frost patterns would appear on sunny days, spreading across the ground like spider webs. My compass would spin wildly in certain spots. And sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, I'd see something tall moving between the trees. But when I turned to look, it was gone. Then came the search party incident. 4 experienced rangers from nearby stations came to help investigate the deaths. They went into the forest one morning, radio contact every hour like clockwork. At noon, the radios went silent. We never found them. Not a single trace. No footprints, no equipment, nothing. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. But what happened to Rex? That's when I knew we were dealing with something beyond human understanding. We were tracking what I thought was a lost hiker. Rex caught a scent and ran ahead. I heard him barking, then a yelp that turned into the most horrible sound I've ever heard. When I caught up to him, I still have nightmares about what I saw. My brave, loyal Rex had somehow been turned inside out, but he was still alive for a few seconds, looking at me with those trusting eyes one last time. I knew then that I had to stop these things, whatever they were. And I had a feeling I knew where to start looking, the old abandoned mine shaft deep in the valley that all the local stories seemed to point to. I loaded up my backpack with everything I thought I might need. Flares, my old service revolver, a box of matches, and some dynamite from our supply shed. I also had Marie's locket around my neck. Somehow, having her close made me feel braver. The mine entrance was about 5 miles into the deepest part of the valley, where the pine trees grew so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. As I got closer to the mine, my compass started going crazy again, spinning in circles. The air got colder with each step, even though it was middle of the afternoon. The frost patterns I'd seen before were everywhere here, spreading across the ground and up the tree trunks like ghostly fingers. The mine entrance was barely visible, half hidden by overgrown bushes. As I stood there gathering my courage, I heard those children's voices again, coming from deep inside the mine. But this time, I could make out what they were saying. "Come play with us, Bill. We've been waiting for you." They knew my name? I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The beam of light seemed to get swallowed up by the darkness. My boots crunched on the frozen ground, which was strange because it shouldn't have been frozen this deep underground. The walls were covered in those same symbols I'd seen on the trees, but these looked older, much older. That's when I saw them. In a large chamber deep in the mine, there were these things. 23 of them I counted. They were tall, maybe 9 feet high, with skin like clouded glass. I could see right through them, like they were made of ice. They moved in ways that weren't natural, like they were floating instead of walking. But their eyes were human, different colors, different sizes, all stolen from their victims over the years, and they were all looking right at me. I reached for my flares, but before I could grab them, one of them spoke in my head, not with words, but with pictures. They showed me Marie. She was standing right there in the chamber, looking just like she did before she got sick. She was smiling, reaching out to me, telling me she'd been waiting. "This isn't real," I said out loud, squeezing her locket tight. "Marie's gone." That's when they showed their true faces. Their faces twisted into something horrible, mouths opening way too wide, showing rows of icy teeth. They started moving toward me, gliding across the ground, leaving trails of frost behind them. I knew I had only seconds to act. I grabbed the flares from my backpack and lit them all at once. The bright phosphorus light filled the chamber, and the creatures screamed, not with voices, but in my head. The sound was like 1,000 pieces of glass breaking at once. The light seemed to hurt them. Their transparent bodies started cracking like ice in warm water. But they were still coming. One of them reached for me, its long fingers passing right through my jacket. The cold was so intense it felt like my heart might stop. I couldn't feel my legs. That's when I saw Marie again, standing among them, crying, begging me to stay. For a second, just a second, I almost believed it was really her. Then I remembered what these things had done to Rex, to Tom, to all those missing people over the years. With my frozen hands, I grabbed the dynamite and my matches. The creatures were all around me now, trying to trap me in their illusions. I saw faces I knew, my army buddies, my parents, even Rex, all telling me to give up. "Marie," I whispered, touching her locket, "help me be strong." I lit the dynamite and threw it toward the back of the chamber, where the walls looked weakest. Then I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, even with my legs feeling like blocks of ice. Behind me, I could hear them coming, feel their cold breath on my neck. The explosion shook the whole mine. Rocks started falling everywhere. One of the creatures grabbed me just as I reached the tunnel. Its touch was like burning ice. I felt its fingers sink into my face, into my left eye. The pain was unbearable. I screamed and pulled away, feeling something tear. I don't remember much after that. Just running, stumbling through the collapsing tunnel, half blind and freezing. When I finally made it outside, the sun was setting. Behind me, the mine entrance had completely caved in. I thought it was over. I really did. But as I sat there in the snow, holding my bleeding face, I noticed something in a puddle of melted snow. In the reflection, I could see them. They were everywhere, watching from between the trees. And now, with my one remaining eye, I can always see them. I transferred to a ranger station in Arizona after that, thinking the desert heat would keep them away. But I was wrong. They don't need the cold anymore. They just needed a way in, through my missing eye, through the part of me they took. And they're spreading. Sometimes, when I look in mirrors or windows or any reflection, I see them walking among regular people, getting closer, growing stronger. Nobody else notices them. Not yet. That's why I am telling this story now, because they're not just in White Pine Valley anymore, they're everywhere. And if you see frost patterns on a warm day, or hear children's voices where there shouldn't be any, or catch a glimpse of something tall and transparent in a reflection, don't look too long. Just run. Because now they're looking for a way into your world too. I didn't write this story just to scare you. I wrote it as a warning. Since that day in 1963, I've been keeping track of similar incidents across the country. Missing people found frozen in summer. Strange symbols appearing overnight. Kids talking about tall, see-through friends that only they can see. Last week, I got a letter from another ranger in Maine. He found a deer, just like the one I discovered all those years ago. Eyes removed, body twisted. When he developed the photos he took, He saw something tall standing in the trees. He asked me what to do. I told him what I am telling you now. If you ever find yourself in a place where the air suddenly gets cold on a warm day, where your compass starts acting weird, or where you hear children's voices when there shouldn't be any, don't investigate. Don't try to be brave. Just leave. I am an old man now, and my remaining eye isn't what it used to be. But I still see them every single day. They're in shop windows, puddles, mirrors, and even in the screens of those fancy smartphones people carry around. Sometimes I catch them watching small children, who can often see them too. The kids wave at them, not knowing what they really are. The creatures have learned a lot since White Pine Valley. They're smarter now, more patient. They don't just hunt in the cold anymore. They don't need to. Because that day in the mine, when they took my eye, they didn't just take a part of me, they found a door into our world. Marie's locket still hangs around my neck. Sometimes when the creatures are close, it turns ice cold. Maybe it's her way of warning me, even now. So I keep telling my story, hoping someone will believe me before it's too late. Because the scariest part isn't what happened back then. It's what's happening right now, all around us. Those symbols I saw in the mine, they're showing up in cities now, in playgrounds, in schools. They're not hiding anymore, they're preparing. So the next time you feel a sudden chill, or see something tall move in the corner of your eye, remember my story. And whatever you do, don't look too long in reflections. Because somewhere in that other world, they're looking back. And they're always hungry for more eyes. My name is Bobby Jackson, and this happened to me back in 1989, when I was working as a ranger in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I come from a family of rangers. My grandfather and father both worked these same trails before me, and I grew up listening to their stories about these mountains. But nothing they told me could have prepared me for what I experienced in the place we locals call the Hollow. I was 35 then, and I thought I knew every inch of these mountains like the back of my hand. I carried my grandfather's old silver pocket watch everywhere. It was the last thing he gave me before he passed away. Maybe that watch saved my life, or maybe it cursed me. Sometimes I am not even sure anymore. You see, I had my own ghost that haunted these hills. When I was just a kid, my little sister Sarah went missing in these woods. We never found her. That's partly why I became a ranger, hoping that somehow, someday, I'd find answers. I spent years studying the local folklore, learning about every strange tale these mountains had to offer. The old-timers always said, the Hollow was different, a place where time didn't work quite right. Even on the clearest days, the Hollow stayed wrapped in this thick, creepy mist. It was the site of an old Civil War battle, and folks said they could sometimes hear phantom gunfire or see soldiers walking through the fog. I didn't believe those stories back then. Now? Well, now I don't know what to believe anymore. This story I am about to tell you, it's going to sound crazy. Honestly, there are days I wake up wondering if it really happened, or if I've lost my mind. But I swear every word is true. It all started when those hikers went missing, and we found them. Changed. That's when I learned that some places in these mountains don't just hold on to the past, they can twist time itself into knots. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when everything started to go wrong. I was doing my usual patrol when the call came in about 2 missing hikers, a young couple who'd gone camping near the Hollow 3 days ago. Something felt different about this case right from the start. The weather was strange that day. The mist in the Hollow was thicker than usual, swirling around my boots as I walked. My compass kept spinning in circles, and my radio would only pick up static. Even the birds were acting weird. They were flying backwards, like someone had pressed rewind on a videotape. I found their campsite first. Everything was exactly where they'd left it, tent still up, coffee cups half full, but covered in a thick layer of dust like they'd been sitting there for years. Not days. The strange part? The coffee was still warm. That's when I noticed the trees. I swear some of them weren't there the day before. They looked old too, like they'd grown overnight. My grandfather's watch started acting up, the hands spinning fast, then slow, then backwards. I'd never seen anything like it in my 15 years as a ranger. Then I heard voices calling for help. They sounded close, but every time I walked toward them, they seemed to come from a different direction. The mist got thicker, and I started seeing strange shadows moving through it. Not animal shadows, not human shadows, something else. I called for backup, and that's when things got really scary. My partner Tom arrived first. We've worked together for years, but what happened next? Well, I still have nightmares about it. We were walking side by side when Tom suddenly stopped. "Bobby," he said, "something's wrong." When I turned to look at him, I couldn't believe my eyes. There were 2 of him standing there, then 4, then 8, each one slightly different, like copies of copies, getting fainter and fainter until they just disappeared. The last thing I heard him say was, "Do you hear that ticking?" After Tom vanished, I knew I had to find those missing hikers fast. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the mist, I spotted 2 people stumbling toward me. They were wearing the same clothes described in the missing persons report, but something was terribly wrong. The young couple who had gone missing were in their 20s, but the people I found looked like they were in their 70s. Their hair had turned white, their faces were wrinkled, and they moved like old people. Yet they were wearing the exact same hiking gear, with the same backpacks and cameras. "What year is it?" the woman asked me, her voice shaking. When I told her it was 1989, she started crying. To them, they'd only been lost for what felt like 3 days. But somehow, they'd aged 50 years. I tried to radio for help again, but instead of static, I heard my own voice coming through, having conversations I hadn't had yet. The mist started moving in weird ways, like it was alive. That's when I saw it for the first time. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, but shadows don't crawl up trees. Shadows don't split into multiple pieces and come back together. And shadows definitely don't make the air ripple like water when they move. It looked like a dark blob that could change its shape, and whenever it passed by, my watch would go crazy. I heard a helicopter approaching, the rescue team I'd called for earlier, but as it got closer to the hollow, something horrible happened. The helicopter started flying in circles, getting slower and slower, like it was stuck in invisible molasses. Then, I can barely describe it. The metal of the helicopter started melting into the people inside. Their screams. I'll never forget those screams. I knew then that whatever was in the hollow wasn't just dangerous, it was playing with time itself. And somehow, my grandfather's old silver watch was the only thing that seemed to work normally around it. Then I heard a familiar voice calling my name, a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. It was Sarah, my little sister who disappeared in these woods all those years ago. She sounded exactly the same as she did the day she vanished. I knew I shouldn't follow Sarah's voice. Every ranger knows you don't chase voices in the woods. But when you've spent 20 years looking for your little sister, common sense sometimes goes right out the window. "Sarah!" I called out, gripping my grandfather's watch tightly. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As I walked deeper into the hollow, I started seeing things that couldn't be real. I saw myself as a kid running through the trees. Then I saw myself as an old man, sitting on a log, looking right at me with sad eyes. The creature was getting bolder now. It slithered between trees like spilled ink, leaving behind patches where time went wrong. I saw a rabbit hop forward, then backward, then turn into a baby rabbit, then an old one, all in seconds. The trees around me kept changing, young to old, old to saplings, over and over. Then I met Jim, our local guide who knew these mountains even better than me. But something was terribly wrong with him. His body was twisted, like someone had grabbed him and turned him inside out, but he was still walking and talking. "Time's all wrong, Bobby," he said, his voice coming from the wrong direction. "It's hungry for more memories." Then he just faded away, like an old photograph. I checked my watch. It was 3:15 p.m., then 8:45 a.m., then midnight. The hands kept spinning, but the watch itself felt warm in my hand, like it was fighting against something. That's when I realized my grandfather's watch wasn't just a watch. It was somehow protecting me from whatever was happening to everyone else. The mist got so thick, I could barely see my own hands. The creature was close now. I could feel it. It wasn't just one thing anymore, but many things, all moving together like a dark river in the air. And in the middle of it all, I saw what looked like a door made of twisted time and memories. I knew I had two choices. I could try to run away, or I could step through that door and face whatever was causing all this. But before I could decide, I heard Sarah's voice one more time. "Bobby, help me. I've been waiting so long." I took a deep breath and stepped through that door. Even now, I am not sure if that was brave or just plain stupid. But I had to know about Sarah, about the creature, about everything. Imagine being in a room full of mirrors, but instead of reflections, each mirror shows a different time. I saw myself at different ages, all moving and living their own lives. Some were happy, some were sad, and some didn't look quite human anymore. But my watch kept ticking, steady and strong, like a heartbeat in all this chaos. The creature was everywhere here. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. It moved like black smoke with hundreds of eyes, each one showing someone's stolen memories. I saw Tom in there, still multiplying endlessly. I saw the helicopter crew, half metal, half human, frozen in time. And I saw Sarah, not just one Sarah, but many. Each one from a different time she might have lived. "You've been taking them," I said out loud. "All these years, you've been feeding on people's memories, their time, their lives." The creature didn't speak with words. Instead, it showed me images. All the lonely years it spent in the hollow, hungry for the time humans took for granted. It showed me how it could give me back Sarah, give me all the different lives we might have had together. But my grandfather's watch was burning hot now, almost glowing. And that's when I understood what I had to do. This thing wasn't just stealing time, it was breaking it. Every memory it took, every life it changed, was making the world more wrong. Someone had to stop it. I held up my watch and started winding it backward. The creature didn't like that, not one bit. It rushed at me from all directions, trying to show me more memories, more possibilities. But I kept winding, even as I felt my own memories starting to slip away. "You can't have them," I said. "You can't have any more of us." The watch started glowing brighter and brighter, and the creature started shrinking back. But I knew this fight wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The creature screeched, a sound like 1,000 clocks breaking all at once. My watch was glowing so bright now that it lit up the whole weird space we were in. I knew what I had to do, but it would cost me everything. "You want memories?" I shouted. "Take mine, all of them, but you have to let everyone else go." I opened the watch and held it up. All my memories started pouring out like a bright river. My childhood, my family, my years as a ranger, even my memories of Sarah. The creature rushed toward them hungrily, but something strange happened. As it swallowed my memories, the watch's light started trapping it, like a net made of time. The creature thrashed and fought, but it was too late. It had taken the bait. My grandfather's watch started ticking backwards faster and faster, pulling everything in like a whirlpool. I saw all the stolen time flowing back where it belonged. The helicopter reformed. Tom became one person again. The aged hikers turned young. But here is the tricky part. When everything snapped back to normal, I didn't just go back to being regular Bobby Jackson. Instead, I got split up. Now there are different versions of me scattered across time, each with different pieces of my memories. Sometimes I am the young ranger who just started the job. Sometimes I am the old man who's been here forever. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself from yesterday or tomorrow, all of us still walking these trails. The only thing we all share is the watch and the knowledge that something happened in the hollow. As for Sarah, well, that's the strangest part. Every now and then, I see a little girl in these woods. Sometimes she's playing. Sometimes she's lost. Sometimes she's grown up. I can never quite reach her, but I know it's her. She exists in all these different times now, just like me. The hollow is quiet these days. The creature is gone, trapped in the space between seconds in my grandfather's watch. But time still acts funny here sometimes. And on misty mornings, when the sun hasn't quite risen, I sometimes meet other versions of myself. We nod and keep walking, each of us searching for Sarah in our own time. I don't know if this story makes much sense to you. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to me either. But if you are ever hiking in the Smoky Mountains and your watch starts acting strange, turn around and walk away. Or if you are brave enough, look for a ranger. Any version of me will do. Just don't expect me to remember everything. That was the price I paid to save everyone else. And if you hear a little girl's voice calling in the woods, well, let me know. I am still looking for her in every time there is. My name is Helen Matthews, and this happened to me back in 1995, when I was working as a ranger in Denali National Park, Alaska. I still get chills thinking about it, and not just because of the cold. I was 43 then, and people called me the Ice Queen. Not because I was mean, but because I knew more about surviving in freezing conditions than anyone else at the park. With my PhD in biology and years of experience in the Arctic, I thought I'd seen it all. But I was wrong. So very wrong. It started during what we call the permanent midnight, that time in winter when Alaska barely sees any sunlight. I had just lost my entire team in an avalanche 3 months before, and maybe that's why they sent me to this remote station. They thought the quiet would help me heal. Instead, it led me to something that would change my life forever. I remember that first night like it was yesterday. The sky was dancing with the most beautiful northern lights I'd ever seen, green and purple ribbons swirling above like giant curtains. But something felt off. My weather equipment, which I always carried with me, was going crazy. The temperature readings made no sense. They were dropping to levels that should have been impossible. That was just the beginning. None of us knew then that those strange ice formations we started finding weren't made by nature. None of us could have guessed that the weird songs coming through our radios were actually warnings. And no one, absolutely no one, could have prepared me for what I was about to face in the endless winter darkness of Alaska. Let me tell you what really happened out there in the deep winter of '95. But I warn you, after hearing this story, you'll never look at ice the same way again. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I still check my thermometer obsessively, even on the warmest days. It all started with the animals. I found a fox one morning, completely frozen solid, but not like normal freezing. It was like someone had turned it into a perfect ice statue while it was running. Its eyes were wide open, terrified. What made it stranger was that there was no snow around it, just bare ground. That's not how animals normally freeze to death. Then came the noises on our radios. Instead of the usual static and chatter, we started hearing what sounded like singing, but not any language I knew. It was like ice cracking mixed with whispers, and it only came on when the temperature dropped really low. Our tech guy, Mike, couldn't explain it. He'd never seen anything like it. "Helen, you need to see this." My partner Jack called one evening. He was pointing at something near the lake. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were ice formations rising from the ground, but they weren't normal icicles. They looked like fingers reaching up from the earth, some as tall as trees. And the weirdest part? They had appeared in just a few hours, on a day when the temperature wasn't even below freezing. The local indigenous people started avoiding the park. When I asked my friend Thomas, who was our guide, he just shook his head and said, "The old stories are waking up. The ice is hungry this year. I should have listened to him more carefully." That's when the research team arrived. 5 scientists who wanted to study the strange ice formations. They set up camp near the lake, and I warned them to be careful. Keep your radio on, I told them. Something's not right out here. The next morning, we found their camp. All 5 sleeping bags were covered in a layer of ice so clear you could see right through it. Inside, well, let's just say nobody was breathing anymore. The strange thing was, their campfire was still burning when we found them. How could they have frozen with a fire still going? I knew then that we were dealing with something that broke all the rules of nature I'd studied in my years as a biologist. But I had no idea just how bad things were about to get. After the research team's death, things got worse really fast. We called in a small plane to help us search the area. I'll never forget what happened during that flight. I was in the control tower when I heard our pilot, Steve, radio in. His voice was shaking. "Helen, there's something out here. Something in the air. It's not clouds, it's not." Then he screamed. Through the tower's window, I watched in horror as his plane just stopped in mid-air. When we found it later, the entire plane was frozen solid, like a toy trapped in an ice cube. Steve was still inside, his hands gripping the controls, frozen in his last moment. That's when Thomas, our indigenous guide, started telling me about his people's stories. "They are the Ice Walkers," he whispered one night by the fire. "They look like people made of clear ice, and they hunger for warmth, for life." He promised to show me some ancient caves, where his ancestors had drawn pictures of these beings. But we never made it to those caves. On our way there, the air suddenly got so cold it hurt to breathe. Thomas saw them first. "Run!" he yelled. I turned around just in time to see him shatter, like a glass statue breaking into a million pieces. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. Back at the station, I told my partner Jack everything. He believed me. He'd seen too many strange things himself not to. We called for help, and a rescue team of 6 people was sent in. I begged them to wait until daylight, but they insisted on starting their search right away. We found them the next morning, all 6 of them. They were standing in a perfect circle, turned into ice statues. Their faces looked peaceful, like they'd just fallen asleep standing up. But their eyes were wide open with fear. Then Jack started acting strange. He said he felt cold inside, no matter how many blankets he used. I watched helplessly as ice crystals slowly spread across his skin from the inside out. His last words to me were, "Helen, I can hear them singing." I was alone now, but I knew I had to find out what these things were and how to stop them. And that's when I remembered the strange readings from my weather equipment pointing to something deep under the ice. My weather equipment kept pointing to something strange under the frozen lake. The readings were off the charts, showing temperatures that were impossible colder than anything ever recorded on Earth. I knew I had to check it out, even though every part of me was screaming to run away. I packed my backpack with flares, thermal charges, like hot explosives we use for avalanche control, and all the heating packs I could find. Something told me that heat might be my only weapon against whatever was down there. Following my equipment's readings, I found a crack in the ice that led to a cave deep under the lake. As I climbed down, the walls around me weren't normal ice. They were covered in what looked like frozen handprints, thousands of them, all reaching upward. That's when I heard that same singing from the radios, but clearer now. It sounded like 1,000 whispers made of crackling ice. My flashlight beam hit something that made me gasp. The cave opened into a massive chamber, and what I saw there still haunts my dreams. They were everywhere, the Ice Walkers. Hundreds of them, standing perfectly still like statues in a museum. They were human-shaped, but completely transparent, like people carved from the clearest ice you've ever seen. And through their clear bodies, I could see something moving, like swirling snowflakes. One of them turned its head toward me. No eyes, no face, just smooth, clear ice. But I knew it saw me. They all did. Suddenly, every single one of them started moving, turning to face me. The air got so cold that my breath froze before it left my mouth. I did the only thing I could think of. I started throwing my thermal charges at the cave ceiling. The Ice Walkers moved toward me, reaching out with their crystalline hands. Everywhere they touched turned to ice instantly. I kept throwing the charges, and that's when I felt it, a rumble from deep below. The ground started shaking. Hot steam began shooting up through cracks in the ice. I'd forgotten something important about Denali. There were dormant volcanoes under all that ice. The cave turned into pure chaos. Hot steam was shooting up everywhere, melting the ice, and the ice walkers were screaming, not with human voices, but with sounds like breaking glaciers. They didn't like the heat one bit. I ran for my life, but they weren't giving up easily. They created an ice maze around me, changing the tunnels as I ran. Every wrong turn meant facing one of them. Their touch was like being stabbed with 1,000 frozen needles. One of them caught my left arm. That's why my fingers on that hand still don't work right. The heat from below was growing stronger. Ice was melting and crashing down everywhere. I could barely see through all the steam, but my survival training kicked in. I followed the warm air currents up, knowing they would lead to the surface. The ice walkers were right behind me, but they were getting slower, weaker. The heat was hurting them. Some of them were actually melting, turning into puddles that quickly refroze into weird shapes. But others were still coming, desperately reaching for me, trying to steal my body heat. Just when I thought I was done for, trapped between a wall of ice and 3 ice walkers, the ground shook one final time. A huge crack opened up beneath us, glowing red with heat from below. The ice walkers fell in, their bodies melting as they dropped. The one closest to me grabbed my boot at the last second. I kicked it off and watched it fall, taking my boot with it. I climbed out of that cave with one bare foot, covered in frost, and barely alive. When the rescue team finally found me 3 days later, I was still shivering in a makeshift shelter, surrounded by heating packs. But here is the really strange part. Something changed in me down there. During my fight with the ice walkers, something of their cold got into my blood. Even today, 30 years later, my body temperature is way below normal, and sometimes, when I am really scared or angry, I can make small ice crystals form on my fingertips. They took me to the hospital, but doctors couldn't explain why my body temperature stayed so low. They said I should be dead, but somehow I was perfectly fine, just really, really cold. Nobody believed my story about the ice walkers. They blamed everything on a natural phenomenon and sealed off that part of the park. But I knew better, and I noticed things were different with me. On hot days, frost would appear on any glass I held too long. Plants would wilt if I touched them when I was upset. At first, it scared me, but slowly I learned to control it. I didn't quit my job at the park. Instead, I started tracking unusual ice formations and temperature drops across Alaska. I created a map of where these things happened, and I noticed a pattern. The ice walkers were moving, following ancient paths under the ice that matched the stories Thomas had tried to tell me about. Last week, my equipment picked up those same strange readings again, but this time near a small town in northern Alaska. The northern lights are getting stronger, just like they were back then. And I've started hearing that familiar singing on my radio late at night. That's why I am telling this story now. I am going back out there next week. But this time, I am ready. I understand them better now, maybe because a part of them lives in me. I know their weakness, and I know they'll return. They always do when the winter gets deep enough. If you are ever up in Alaska during the dark winters, and you see ice forming in impossible ways, or hear strange songs in the static of your radio, don't ignore it like we did. Run. Run as fast as you can toward warmth and light. Because the ice walkers are real, and they're still out there, waiting in the deep winter for someone to wander too far into their frozen world. And if you hear about strange ice formations or mysterious freezings in the news, well, now you know what's really happening. And you'll know I am out there, trying to stop them again. My name is Jack Morrison, and this happened to me back in 1981. I was 41 then, working as a ranger in Oregon's Cascade Mountains. Before that, I'd spent years in the Marine Force Recon, but this story, This story is about something that changed my life forever. Let me take you back to those misty mountains. You know how some places just feel different? Well, our part of the Cascades was exactly like that. The fog there never really lifted. It just hung around like a thick blanket, hiding God knows what in its shadows. The whole area was ancient volcanic land, with hot springs bubbling up from underground and a history that gave me chills. We'd had strange things happen before, lots of dead animals found in weird places, but nothing like what I am about to tell you. I wasn't always alone up there in the mountains. Used to have a partner, Dave. We worked together for 3 years until what we thought was a regular wolf attack. That day changed me. Started carrying silver bullets after that. People laughed, called me paranoid, but I knew something wasn't right about how Dave died. No normal wolf attacks the way that one did. I'd spent years studying wolves, learning their behavior patterns, their habits. What was coming for us wasn't anything like the wolves I knew. This was something else entirely. Something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I remember the day it all started. The morning was colder than usual, and that darned fog was thicker than pea soup. I got a call about some cattle mutilations up at old Thompson's farm. Didn't know it then, but that call would be the beginning of the strangest and scariest months of my life. Want to hear what happened next? Well, grab a seat, because this story, it's not for the faint of heart. And the worst part? Some of what I am about to tell you is still out there, hiding in those mountains, waiting. When I got to Thompson's farm that morning, something felt off right away. The animals weren't making their usual sounds, no mooing, no nothing, just silence. That's never a good sign on a farm. Thompson was waiting for me by his barn, looking pale and shaky. "Jack," he said, his voice trembling, "I've never seen anything like this in my 40 years of farming." He led me to the back field, and I felt my stomach turn. 3 of his cows lay there, but they weren't just killed. They were cut up with the kind of precision you'd see in a surgery room. No blood anywhere, just clean cuts. What kind of animal could do that? But that wasn't the weirdest part. Around the cows, I found footprints, big ones. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear, but these were different. They had 6 toes instead of 5, and they were huge, bigger than any print I'd ever seen in my years as a ranger. I took some photos and made plaster casts. Something in my gut told me I'd need proof of what I was seeing. Over the next few days, more reports came in. Other farms, same kind of attacks. But then, I started finding something even stranger in the forest. Dead wolves arranged in perfect circles like someone, or something, had placed them there on purpose. This wasn't random. This was planned. I set up some tests in the forest, puzzle boxes with food inside that even clever animals like raccoons would struggle with. The next day, not only were the boxes opened, but they were solved in ways that showed real thinking. Whatever was out there wasn't just strong, it was smart. The worst part was the fog. It seemed to get thicker each day, like it was trying to hide something. At night, I'd hear howls that didn't sound quite right. Not like wolves, not like dogs, but something in between. Something wrong. I reported everything to my superiors, but they just laughed it off. Probably just some wild dogs, they said. Maybe a bear. But I knew better. I'd been in these woods too long to be fooled. Something was coming, something big, and I had a feeling I was the only one who could see it. That's when I decided to set up cameras around the forest. If nobody would believe my words, maybe they'd believe what they saw with their own eyes. Looking back now, I wish I hadn't. Sometimes, there are things we're better off not seeing. The first real proof of what we were dealing with came from the logging camp. I remember getting the emergency call at 3 a.m. When I got there, my flashlight beam showed something that still gives me nightmares. The entire camp was destroyed. 12 people had been there. Good, hard-working folks I'd known for years. But they weren't dead. No, what happened to them was worse. Much worse. I found Jerry, the camp supervisor, hiding in the equipment shed. He was different. His eyes had changed, looking more like an animal's than a human's. His fingers had grown longer, and when he spoke, his voice was like a growl. "They came from the fog, Jack," he whispered, "tall as trees, looking like wolves but walking like men. They did something to us, changed us." Before I could help him, Jerry started screaming. I watched in horror as his body began to change. His spine curved, his face stretched forward, and fur began sprouting all over his skin. The other camp workers, the ones I couldn't find, I realized they'd already changed. That same week, I lost 3 of my fellow rangers. They were good men, Mike, Tom, and Luis. They went to check on some strange noises near the hot springs. We found their gear 2 days later, torn to pieces. The weird thing were signs of a fight, but no blood, not a single drop. I knew I needed help, so I called in the National Guard. 8 soldiers came, all armed to the teeth. "Don't worry, Ranger Morrison," their leader said. "Whatever's out there, we'll handle it." They didn't last the night. I heard their screams through my radio. By the time I got there, all I found were empty uniforms and broken weapons. The creatures had been playing with us, testing us. They weren't just animals, they were hunters, planners. A local reporter, Sarah Chen, and her cameraman didn't believe my warnings. They went into the woods to get the real story. 3 days later, we found their camera. The footage. I still can't talk about what I saw on that tape, but I keep it locked away, as proof that I am not crazy. Then I lost Jenny, my new partner. She was tough, smart, and didn't believe in monsters, until the night they took her. When I saw her again a week later, she wasn't Jenny anymore. She'd become one of them, what they called a breeding female. Her eyes. They were still human enough to show pain, to show she remembered who she was. That's what haunts me the most. I knew I had to find where these creatures came from. Following their tracks led me deep into a part of the mountains I'd never seen before. That's where I found it, an old military lab, half hidden by vines and trees. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the truth was inside. In the lab's damp basement, I found old files and photos. They'd been doing experiments, trying to create super soldiers by mixing wolf and human DNA. Something went wrong. Of course it did. The creatures escaped, smarter and stronger than their creators ever planned. They'd been living in these mountains, growing their numbers, waiting. But I didn't have much time to read. They found me there, 30 or more of them. Huge things, standing 8, maybe 10 feet tall. They looked like wolves but walked on 2 legs, with hands that could crush steel. Their fur seemed to move like shadows, and their eyes glowed in the darkness. I ran deeper into the underground tunnels. I knew these mountains had a whole system of caves and underground rivers. That would be my only chance. The creatures followed, their howls echoing off the walls. But I had a plan. You see, these tunnels were full of natural gas pockets. That's why the military picked this place. One spark in the right spot and, well, you get the idea. I had some dynamite in my pack. Always carry some for clearing fallen trees. As they got closer, I set my trap. The fight was brutal. The pack alpha, bigger than the others, came at me himself. We fought hand to hand in those dark tunnels. His claws tore into my shoulder, but I managed to plant the dynamite where I needed it. Just as more of them were closing in, I hit the detonator. The explosion was huge. The tunnel collapsed behind me as I ran, water from the underground river flooding in. I could hear their howls turning to panic as the water rushed in. I barely made it out alive. But here's the thing. I didn't get away clean. One of them bit me during the fight. I can feel the change trying to happen, like something wild trying to get out. The only thing keeping me human is silver nitrate. I have to inject it every day. Hurts like hell, but it's better than the alternative. You'd think that would be the end of the story, but it isn't. Not really. Some of them survived. The smarter ones, the ones who'd stayed back from the fight. And now things are complicated. See, the bite changed me enough that I can sense them, feel what they're feeling. They can sense me too. We reached what you might call an understanding. I protect the border between their world and ours, keeping people away from their territory, and they stay in their part of the mountains. Every full moon, I feel the pull stronger. The silver nitrate burns in my veins, but it keeps me human, mostly. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the mirror, and my eyes have that same wild look. My senses are sharper now. I can smell a storm coming days before it hits, hear conversations from half a mile away. But here is what keeps me up at night. Those military files I found, they had dates and codes on them, recent ones. Someone's still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes I see black helicopters circling the mountains at night, men in suits asking questions in town. They're looking for something, and I don't think they've given up on their experiment. I am still a ranger, still protect these mountains. But now, I protect them from both sides, keeping humans safe from what's in those woods, and keeping those woods safe from humans who might want to create more monsters. If you are ever hiking in the Cascades and the fog starts rolling in thick, if you hear howls that sound almost like words, or if you see eyes glowing in the darkness, turn around, go home. Some territories aren't meant for us anymore. And if you are wondering why I am telling this story now, because I am not getting any younger, and the silver nitrate doesn't work as well as it used to. Someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to be ready. Because I won't be here forever, but they will be. And something tells me this isn't over, not by a long shot. My name is Maria Rodriguez, and this happened to me back in 1977, when I was working as a forest ranger in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was 38 then, and I thought I'd seen everything during my time as an Army medic. But what I experienced that winter changed my life forever, and not in a good way. Let me start by telling you who I am. I grew up in a small town near the wilderness, where my grandmother taught me about our Native American heritage and the old stories that most people dismissed as myths. After serving as a medic in the Army for 8 years, I came back home to become a forest ranger. It felt right, being close to the land my ancestors lived on for generations. But there was another reason I chose this job. 20 years ago, my younger brother Danny disappeared in these same woods. They never found him, and that mystery has haunted me every single day since. I always felt that these ancient forests held secrets, dark ones that most people wouldn't believe. The locals always whispered about how every 40 years, people would go missing in these parts. They talked about strange lights, weird sounds, and animals acting crazy. I never paid much attention to those stories until that fall when everything started going wrong. Really wrong. I guess I should have noticed the signs earlier. The compass on my belt would spin wildly for no reason. The sky stayed in this weird twilight state even in the middle of the day. And the temperature, well, that's where our story really begins. It all started on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was doing my usual patrol when I noticed something odd. Hundreds of deer were running south, which wasn't normal for that time of year. They looked scared, really scared. Not the kind of fear you see when there's a predator around, but something different. Their eyes were wide with terror, and they didn't even notice me as they rushed past. That same evening, something even stranger happened. The temperature dropped like crazy, from a normal 50 degrees to below freezing in just one night. I've lived in Michigan my whole life, and I'd never seen anything like it. The trees started crackling as their branches froze, and the radio in my ranger station kept picking up weird static. Then came the screams. At first, I thought I was hearing things. It sounded like someone calling out names in the distance. I heard Maria, Maria, floating through the trees. It sounded exactly like Danny's voice, my missing brother. But that was impossible. He'd been gone for 20 years. The next morning, I found the first sign that something was terribly wrong. The trees near my station were twisted into spiral shapes, like giant corkscrews reaching up to the sky. No storm could do that. While I was looking at them, dozens of dead birds just fell from the sky. When I checked them, their insides were frozen solid, even though it wasn't that cold anymore. I called my fellow ranger, Mark Peters, on the radio. "Mark, you need to see this. Something's not right." "I know," he said, his voice shaking. "Maria, I just found some really weird footprints in the snow. They look human, but bigger. And they're smoking, like whatever made them was so cold it froze the ground underneath." That's when I remembered my grandmother's warnings about winter spirits and the hunger that comes with the cold. I had always thought they were just stories to keep kids from wandering into the woods alone. Now I was starting to think those stories might be real. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of our nightmare. That night, everything got worse. 2 hikers stumbled into my station, barely alive. Their clothes were torn, and their skin was blue from the cold. What they told me made my blood freeze. It called to us," the woman whispered, shaking uncontrollably. "It sounded like my daughter, but when we followed the voice, she started crying." Her husband finished the story. "This thing, it was tall, so tall. Skinny like a skeleton, but strong. Its skin was like ice. It moved so fast like a blur. It bit Jerry, our friend. And then Jerry, he changed." I gave them hot coffee and wrapped them in blankets while calling for help. But the phones weren't working, and the radio just gave out static. We were stuck. Then we heard it. A scratching sound on the station's roof. The lights flickered, and the temperature inside dropped so much I could see my breath. The hikers grabbed each other, terrified. "Please," the woman begged, "don't let it in." Something crashed against the window. In the dim light, I saw a face, if you could call it that. It was white as snow, with black, empty eyes and a mouth full of icy teeth. It was grinning at us. I grabbed my rifle, but deep down, I knew regular bullets wouldn't help much. My grandmother had taught me about these creatures, wendigos, ancient spirits of winter and hunger. But she'd never said there could be more than one. The radio suddenly crackled to life. It was Mark. "Maria, they're everywhere. The whole Williams family, they're turning into these things. I am at the North Tower, and I need—" His voice cut off with a scream. I looked at the terrified hikers and made a quick decision. There was an old bunker behind the station, used for storing emergency supplies. "Run to the bunker," I told them. "Lock yourselves in. Don't open the door for anyone, not even if they sound like someone you know." As they ran out the back door, I grabbed my emergency pack and my grandmother's old medicine pouch. Inside was everything I needed for the ritual she'd taught me, just in case. I never thought I'd actually need to use it. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the darkness. The snow was falling, but it wasn't normal snow. It was sharp, like tiny pieces of glass. The wind howled, carrying voices that kept calling my name. I tried to radio for help again. Somehow, I got through to the sheriff's department. "We're sending 6 deputies your way," the dispatcher said, but I wanted to tell them not to come. I knew it was already too late. As I walked through the woods, I saw them, dark shapes moving between the trees, faster than anything should move. My flashlight beam caught one of them for just a second. It was like looking at a person who had been stretched too tall, with skin pulled tight over bones. Its fingers were long icicles, and its breath came out like freezing mist. Then I heard the helicopter. Someone must have called in air support. But as it flew overhead, I watched in horror as ice suddenly covered its rotors. The helicopter spun out of control and disappeared behind the trees. There was a loud crash, then silence. I knew I had to find the source of all this. My grandmother used to say that evil things always have a nest, a place they call home, and these creatures had to come from somewhere. That's when I remembered something. There was an old cave system near where Danny disappeared 20 years ago. My heart sank as I realized where I needed to go. As I got closer to the caves, the air got colder and colder. I found tracks in the snow, lots of them. Some looked human, Others were those huge smoking footprints I'd seen before. They all led to the same place. Then I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Maria, sis, I've been waiting for you." I turned around slowly, my heart pounding. There, standing in the swirling snow, was my brother Danny. But it wasn't really him anymore. He was stretched tall, his skin pale as death, his eyes black and empty. He smiled at me, with teeth made of ice. "Danny," I whispered, "what did they do to you?" Danny, or what used to be Danny, took a step toward me. "Join us, sister," he said, his voice like cracking ice. "The hunger, it makes us stronger. We're a family here." I backed away, reaching for my grandmother's medicine pouch. "You are not my brother anymore," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The real Danny would never hurt people." He laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass. Behind him, more wendigos emerged from the trees. I recognized some of them, the missing deputies, the Williams family, and even Mark. They all moved together, like they shared one mind. I ran into the cave. I knew it was dangerous, but I also knew what I had to do. My grandmother had taught me that wendigos hate two things: fire and certain ancient rituals. I had brought both. Inside the cave, what I saw made me sick. The walls were covered in ice, and there were bones everywhere. This was their nest, where they brought their victims. Some of the victims were still alive, trapped in ice, slowly turning into wendigos themselves. I worked quickly, setting up the ritual items from my pouch, sacred herbs, special stones, and the emergency flares from my ranger pack. The wendigos were getting closer. I could hear their screams echoing through the cave. "You can't stop us, Maria," Danny's voice called out. "The hunger is spreading. Soon the whole forest will be ours." My hand shook as I lit the herbs and started the ritual my grandmother had taught me. The wendigos shrieked. The smoke from the burning herbs seemed to hurt them, but it wasn't enough. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I pulled out all my flares and the emergency fuel from my pack. If I couldn't stop them here, they would spread beyond the forest. I couldn't let that happen. "I am sorry, Danny," I whispered, and threw the first flare. The cave exploded into chaos. The flares ignited the fuel, and flames raced along the icy walls. The wendigos screamed, not like animals, but like people in terrible pain. For a moment, I saw their real faces through the ice and darkness, scared, hungry, lost. Danny lunged at me, his icy claws grazing my arm. The cold burned worse than any fire, and I could feel the infection trying to spread. Without thinking, I pulled out my hunting knife and did something I'll never forget. I cut off my own arm just below where he'd scratched me. The pain was horrible, but the wendigo infection was worse. I wrapped my arm quickly with my emergency bandage and stumbled toward the cave entrance. Behind me, the fire was spreading faster than I'd expected. The heat was making the ice melt, causing the cave ceiling to collapse. "You'll become one of us anyway," Danny's voice echoed behind me. "The hunger always wins." I made it outside just as the cave entrance collapsed. The fire had spread to the trees now, and I could hear the wendigos trapped inside the cave, their screams getting weaker. I radioed for help with my good arm, and this time, it worked. They found me passed out in the snow. The forest fire burned for 3 days before they could put it out. The official story blamed it on a freak accident. Nobody believed my story about the wendigos, but they couldn't explain all the missing people or the strange tracks in the snow. But that's not the end of the story. Sometimes at night, I feel a terrible hunger. When it's cold, I can sense other wendigos out there, hiding in different forests. The infection is still inside me, trying to spread. Every day is a fight not to give in to it. I've been assigned to track down other wendigo outbreaks now. The government doesn't call them that, of course. They use words like unknown predators or environmental anomalies. But I know what they really are. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when I hear voices calling in the dark, I wonder if Danny is still out there somewhere. Maybe some part of him survived. Maybe someday I'll find him again. But next time, I'll be ready.